Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Garrity. I'm the historian for Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and I'm joined by Professor Liam Riordan, Professor of History at the University of Maine. We're talking about his article in the forthcoming issue of Chebacco. It's titled Mount Desert Island and the Long Struggle for Maine Statehood. This article is on its way to you by mail if you're a member of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. We received the latest issue. We're pretty excited about it and happy to have this time with Liam to have this discussion and learn about Maine statehood and how it came about. And Liam, I'm going to start by asking you to read us a passage from your article, Mount Desert Island and the Long Struggle for Maine Statehood.
Great, thanks, Tim. I am happy to have been invited to write for the journal and also to be part of this discussion today. The quote I'm going to read is from the opening of my essay, but I need to set it up just a little bit before I start reading. So in the title, I talk about the long struggle for Maine statehood. And I sort of begin by saying this is a puzzle to a lot of people in Maine because we sort of assume statehood would have happened very quickly, right? If you had the choice to separate from Massachusetts, most Mainers today would say, yes, I'll do it right away. So we sort of think that's what they would have thought back in the statehood era as well. But it actually takes 6 votes, 6 separate elections from 1792 to 1819 before that separation happens, before a large enough majority has voted in favor of separation. So in doing some of my research on the early part of this process, I ran across a kind of I was sort of thinking about, well, what does separation, statehood mean for MDI in particular, but also just east of the Penobscot River. And in one of the earliest conventions to have people gather together to discuss the possibility, one that was held in 1793, there were no delegates from Hancock and Washington County who attended. Now, both those counties were only created in 1789, so they've got small populations, and of course, travel is difficult and costly. And so at that convention, there was a proposal that, well, why don't we just let Hancock and Washington County stay part of Massachusetts? We, the more populous 3 western counties, could separate and become independent. So that led me to speculate a little bit, and that's what I'm going to read from the start of my essay, right? What if that had happened, right? What if Hancock and Washington County stayed part of Massachusetts and those 3 counties to the west became independent? So one wonders how such a course might have set down East Maine on a very different path, perhaps as another independent state in New England, or even as a British province. Could the British military presence in the region at the end of the War of 1812 have led it to become part of New Brunswick via a renewed vision of Acadia? Or might it have been built on the legacy of New Ireland, the short-lived refuge for Revolutionary War loyalists east of the Penobscot River? Now, of course, no such division occurred in 1793, but the popularity of separation in Hancock County and on MDI in particular would persistently lag far behind that of other places in Maine, even as the separation movement changed in fundamental ways.
So in this particular issue of Chebacco, there's at least 3 occasions, maybe 4, when there was a good chance that Maine east of the Penobscot could have ended up in Canada. And this is probably one of the last chances to appear in a historical timeline where that might have happened. And I know we want to ask, why did it take 30 years? How did this struggle play out over time? And why did it start when it did and end when it did?
So what we're looking at here are sort of color-coded votes on the separation question in these 6 instances from 1792 to 1819. And I think it helps us to see more quickly the very long period it took for statehood to be achieved, and also that there's some real ups and downs. The map doesn't get gradually a solid purple color. We can see in 1807, that middle vote, every county in the state except for Lincoln voted against separation. And I guess the most basic thing this reminds us is just how difficult and uncertain this question was. And so what I often suggest is it's sort of similar to Brexit today, right? There's a lot of controversy and a lot of uncertainty about what it will mean when Great Britain now separates from the European Union. And I think there were a lot of similar fears in this early period of Maine history that only get, finalized in that vote in July of 1819, when every single county has a majority in favor of independence. Well, what's interesting from an MDI perspective is that Hancock County, which you see here in lighter purple, had the lowest vote in favor of separation even in 1819. So it does have a majority. It's moved in that direction. But on MDI, the opposition is even more incredible. I grouped a number of towns sort of in the MDI area, and they only vote 20% in favor of independence, even as late as 1819. So we can see on the orange line how much higher the state vote in favor of independence is, and the dramatic way in which MDI lags behind.
And for those of our audience who are on Mount Desert Island, or next time you're here, up on Beach Hill Road, you can see the place where that vote took place. It was the Wasgot House, and it's on the road that leads up to Beach Mountain Trailhead. So we know that the vote took place there in, was it July or August, the summer of 1819. The vote was 13-0 in opposition to statehood. And then, Liam, before I started hanging out with you, I would have said that Maine statehood was all about the slavery issue. But I've come to understand from your article that that came very late in the game. Can you help us understand why that was the case?
Sure. So it's absolutely true that the most famous thing associated with Maine statehood is the crisis that arose with the admission of Missouri as a slave state. And so that petition from Missouri had preceded Maine's request to join the United States. So we have this long period of votes. It's finally resolved by the strong majority in favor of independence in July 1819. Then there's a constitutional convention that gets hammered out, that gets approved by voters in the state, and then a petition goes to the US Congress to request admission. And that happens in the very beginning of 1820. Well, that arrives in the US Congress after it has been deadlocked for almost a year over the controversy of admitting Missouri. And the House of Representatives had voted to only allow Missouri to become a state if slavery was outlawed there. And that anti-slavery stand by the House of Representatives was blocked by the US Senate. And they refused to dictate the terms on which Missouri would enter. And so that really was the first major crisis in national politics over slavery in US history. There's some discussions of it at the Constitutional Convention, but that wasn't really a public controversy. That was, a discussion among a small number of delegates. So it is a strikingly important moment when this issue is really front and center for the first time in national politics.
And at the time, Maine had 7 congressional representatives. Now we only have 2. It just shows how the population has moved away from us.
Right.
And how did Maine's congressional delegation vote on this issue?
So this is really fascinating. The vote in the Maine, for Maine representatives to the US Congress was 5 opposed to statehood and 2 in favor. That is that they said, we have to become a state by being yoked to slavery being accepted in Missouri, then we don't want to be a part of it. And the vote was extremely close in the US Congress. If those 2 Maine representatives in the minority had voted with the majority to oppose slavery in Missouri, that would have been enough for the proposal not to pass the US Congress. And there are only a handful of exceptions of congressmen who didn't sort of vote with their north-south section. So this is really a significant tipping point, and really was the 2 main congressmen who voted in favor of this really shifted the country on a very significant issue.
What do you think might have happened if 2 of Maine's congressmen had flipped their vote?
Well, I think it is sort of like that, what if Hancock and Washington County had separated, right? This is always one of the sort of fun things in history, but also highly speculative. Of course, we don't really know. But I like to imagine that had the expansion of slavery been tackled more thoroughly in 1820, that we might have had a very different sort of course of US history. It's really right around this point that slavery's expansion to the South is accelerating. And it's only going to grow more powerful with each plantation that opens and each, greater migration of enslaved labor into the Deep South. So slavery is only going to grow stronger. And, what we end up having in the Civil War is a, tragic catastrophe of loss of life. If there would have been a way to head that off, or even to have had it occur earlier, I like to think there would have been less loss of life and less bloodshed.
Fascinating. Well, I know here's a touch of how the newspaper reported this issue. I think we want to get to a point you make in your article that the much of the story has been told from an Anglo perspective, and you've spent some time thinking about the fate of the Wabanaki and the French-speaking population of Maine in all kinds of ways. And I wonder if you'd touch on that for us.
So it obviously is really important that we include a sense of Wabanaki history when we think about this period. And I think this is one of the things that the issue of Chebacco does extraordinarily well, and really has a number of, sort of textual commentaries, but also really impressive photo of what is a place of indigenous people in the history of this region. And so I like this map that's from the Portland Press Herald, because it does remind us of the extent of the Wabanaki region, that transnational and covers a number of different states. And I think the critical issue that gets called to the fore with Maine statehood is the question of sovereignty. Maine is going to be independent of Massachusetts. It's going to be a sovereign political entity. And
we've lost Liam Riordan, and we're going to see if we can get him back. I think he will probably try to sign in by Zoom. So we'll hope to we'll hope to bring him back. But while we're waiting for Liam to sign in again, let's see if you have any questions. In our audience, do you have that option? Oh, Liam, you're back. Good. Glad to see you. Oh, I have to unmute you, I think, or you have to unmute yourself.
Yes. All right.
Yeah, here you go.
Sorry.
Oh, so glad to see you. I was going to sing and dance. I think we may have, let's finish up on the Wabanaki and the French, and then let's see what kind of questions are out there.
So I'm not quite sure when I cut out there, but this issue of Wabanaki sovereignty and their relationship to the new state of Maine is really an important one. And when we look at the decades after statehood, this really marks an intensification of the dispossession of Wabanaki people. So it's really crucial that we not just celebrate statehood and the independence process, we also have to reflect on the way in which it accelerated the colonization of Maine, much to the loss of Wabanaki people. At the same time, they maintain a connection to, well, particularly the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot, maintain an ongoing and unbroken connection that is recognized in law to their traditional homelands. So this, I think, is really a fascinating issue and a kind of distinctive aspect of Penobscot and Passamaquoddy history when we look at indigenous groups east of the Mississippi in the United States. You also asked about French. What's the significance of Maine statehood for French speakers in what's now the state of Maine? And this also raises a really important issue of how we sort of conceptualize, well, what was the state of Maine in 1820? So the map that's up now is a 1820 map by a terrific Maine surveyor and cartographer named Moses Greenleaf. And it more or less gives us a sense of the state of Maine that we know now, but it just projects those counties kind of going to infinity off to the north. And the northern boundary of the state of Maine will not be firmly established until 1842. And this really leaves French speakers on the St. John River in a state of limbo, sort of unsure of where their place is. And so statehood for people living in the St. John Valley, both in the statehood era, but to some degree today, raises real questions of their feeling of being at the margin of public life in Maine, of not being considered centrally. And all of those votes that I spoke about before on the statehood question were all done by people living in the very southern, coastal, and western parts of the state. So in terms of the voting public, this map of the state of Maine is quite misleading.
And we have a question, Liam, from Nat Fenton. He asks, who were the two representatives who voted for separation?
So John Holmes of Alfred, Maine is really the leader on this issue. And he has quite voluminous papers that are preserved at the Maine Historical Society. So we really can kind of get inside his head. And one of the things that is, kind of fascinating. So you saw those newspapers before. Each of the sides, those congressional votes, explained why they took their stand to the public. And John Holmes wrote one of those letters, and he sent that letter to Thomas Jefferson. He was a Jeffersonian Republican. He was, showing off to the top person in his party. And Jefferson wrote back to Holmes, and that letter to that Jefferson wrote about the Missouri crisis really has some of the most famous language about that event. This is a letter where Jefferson talks about this crisis awakening him like a fire bell in the night.
Yeah.
And, Jefferson, of course, has this incredible command of language and talks about these things in a really stirring way. But like Holmes, Jefferson supported the expansion of slavery. What awakens him in such fear is not that slavery is expanding, it's that it might be limited in the future by the sort of compromise line that's drawn across the longitude line at the southern boundary of Missouri.
And you mentioned the Federalists. Are there parallels between political parties as they were today and as we understand them now? Or I understand they're very different. Can you help us understand what the differences are between political parties as they work then and political parties as they operate now?
So, I think one helpful way to approach this question is that in Maine history from the statehood era, there is often a lot of attention paid to the difference between people living on the coast and people who lived in the interior. And coastal settlements are more strongly Federalist. That's a conservative, more hierarchical political party of that era. And people who lived in the interior are more often Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Republican success in this era is that they've reached out to the common voter more aggressively and more effectively. And they're really speaking to poorer settlers away from the coast, newer arrivals to the state of Maine. So there is this sort of coastal interior split that, not in every case, but that broadly holds true. And I do think there's a rough parallel to our sense of Maine today, where people often talk about Maine being divided into the two Maines, that the two congressional districts have sort of different profiles, although now both with Democrats, that's not always the case. And I guess one of the cautions I always like to add about this is that I do think it's very simplistic to only think about Maine culture as bipolar and with two faces on it. And if we think about some of the examples I've spoken about already, French-speaking people up in the St. John Valley, Wabanaki people, there are more than two Maines. And we really enrich our contemporary world, but also our understanding of statehood by being open to more than just sort of a bipolar vision of Maine in the past and Maine in the present.
Well, Liam, I want to ask you about the experience you've had in the last year, because I know you've taken this show on the road to at least 50 different places in Maine to talk about the bicentennial. And you've been a history professor at the University of Maine since 1997, but I have the sense that you really learned a lot in the last year. And I wonder what some of those surprising lessons that you picked up in the course of your travels and discussions with people all around the state.
So I've learned a great deal by sort of taking my Maine Statehood show on the road. And it's been fascinating when I gave a talk in Madawaska, when I gave a talk in Eastport, the powerful sense of place that informs people's understanding of the past. And I think this is something near and dear to the heart and the mission of any local historical society, a passion for the local, a sense of often genealogical connection to long-term families that are in these places. And I guess the thing that is particularly fascinating to me is how do we sort of harness that love of history and that passion for history at the local level, but also understand it in a broader context where, the very local missions of any given historical society has differences, but also some really important commonalities with the people across the river, the group over the mountain, other places in the state. So that has been a great education for me. And it also, again, really challenges that sense of just a simple two Maine sort of argument. Every town thinks about where these lines are differently. The anecdote I often tell is when I gave a talk in Madawaska, people thanked me for coming from Bangor in southern Maine to, have a conversation with them. And of course, people in Bangor don't really think of themselves in southern Maine, but from the perspective of the St. John Valley, that is a very reasonable way to think about where you might draw the lines of the two Maines.
Well, now the questions are coming fast and furious by Q&A and by chat, and I'm sure there's some that I can't see on Facebook Live, but let's try a question from Rick Wheeler. He asks, what were the emotional hot button issues that would have made MDI residents opposed to Maine statehood?
So this is, of course, the million-dollar question, right? We know that voters in the MDI area never embrace Maine independence, right? Even in 1819, when over 70% of this, what's now will be the state, votes in favor of it, MDI voters are only 20% in favor of this issue. Now, why, of course, is a more challenging question. And I think that one of the profound reasons that people on MDI were hesitant is that they were more concerned about the people who would be the leaders in the new state of Maine than they were about the older political elite that they had lived under in Massachusetts. So, sort of the bully, the tyrant, the status quo might be better than the person that's a little bit closer. And I do, then as now, MDI had a very different sense of itself than the population centers of what would be the state of Maine, Cumberland County, Lincoln County. These were, places that seem very different to lightly settled coastal MDI that had a lot of commerce and connections with Massachusetts.
Well, someone asked about the coasting law. That's something that people people are aware of. Can you explain what that coasting law was, and do you think what effect it might have had?
So the coasting law is one of the major factors in the anti-separation argument. And basically the federal law allowed states to trade with other states that they were adjoining without needing to pay any kind of tariff or financial penalty that the states might set up. And Massachusetts has this kind of unusual geography. So if you were a merchant and were exchanging goods from Eastport, you could get all the way to New Jersey before you weren't in a quote unquote adjoining state with Massachusetts. So much of the coast of Maine was tied to the ocean, to shipping, to maritime commerce, that this is a persistent, successful argument for why Maine should stay part of Massachusetts so that it doesn't get penalized by this coasting law. Now, the Jeffersonian Republicans in Maine who are pressing for separation, they realize this is a problem, and they've got national control in Washington, D.C., so they get this law passed, get the coasting law overturned, and they create districts. And that happens in 1818, right before that final successful vote for independence. So that does really demolish the anti-statehood argument in the July 1819 vote. But again, that doesn't matter to voters on MDI, right? They don't really care about the coasting law in a decisive way, it would seem, because they're just as opposed to separation without the coasting law in 1819 as they were in those earlier votes.
Well, this time flew by as we knew it would. I want to encourage our listeners to to see the new issue of Chebacco, where Liam will go into Liam's article is really excellent. But there, there's one provocative question that Michael Penko put out there, and I really want to put it to you. He writes, and we'll finish on this. If the vote in 1820 had gone down the other way, might the states of Missouri and Maine determine their own fates with respect to the question of slavery? Would we have seen bloody Missouri?
So that's an interesting counterfactual I've not really thought about. And I think, so I'd really want to look a little bit more closely at the presence and geographic location of the sort of slave dominant areas in Missouri. But I do think that's a real possibility, that the recourse to violence in American political life is often quite close to the surface, and I think never more so than on the question of slavery. So perhaps that would have been, if it, what happens with Kansas is that they allow popular sovereignty in Kansas to decide the issue in the 1850s, and this leads extremists on both sides to mobilize there with terrible consequences. Perhaps that would have happened as well in Missouri. I guess my hope would be that slavery had not intensified quite enough yet by 1820 that we would have headed off some of the violence that we know from the 1850s and the Civil War itself.
Well, Liam, thank you. To our viewers, I want to invite you back next week, same time, same place. A University of Maine PhD student, Brittany Getting, will be talking about her article about women leaders in the early 19th century. And a good part of her story is how she figured that out, because so many women's voices were silenced. They weren't carried forward. They didn't operate in the sphere of commerce or politics very frequently. So Brittany has a very interesting story to tell, to perceive what roles women in leadership played on Mount Desert Island in the early 19th century. So I hope you'll join us then. Liam, it's always great to spend time with you. Thanks so much for being with us. Folks, you'll be able to see this recording on Facebook Live, and we'll include the Zoom link so you can share it. I hope you can join us next week. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Tim, for the invitation. It was really a pleasure.
All right, take care, everybody. Take care of each other. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.